Hi, welcome to the University of Louisiana System presentation on trauma-informed classroom instruction. We're going to be going over what trauma-informed classroom instruction is and how understanding it can really help you in your practice. To get started today, first, let's introduce your presenters.
I am Beth Blankenship. I direct the Center for Teaching Innovation at University of New Orleans.
And I'm Meredith King. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Teaching Innovation at the University of New Orleans. So in today's presentation, like I said, we're just going to be going over a few different things, and here's a little bit of an outline of what we'll be doing. First, we're going to do a little bit of a check-in, which I know can be weird in an asynchronous presentation, but I think it's really important to take a moment and check in with ourselves, even in this type of environment, especially given the subject matter. Then we're going to go over what trauma-informed classroom instruction is, some principles and examples, some grounding and settling practices, both for us and our students, and then some basic do's and don'ts of engaging with someone when they're having a trauma response. So that's the basic outline of what we'll be doing today in this presentation. To begin, let's start with something that we're calling Where Ya At? Since this is Louisiana, I think we're, trying to be a little bit cute with that title. So the first thing that I'd want everyone to do, and I recommend this as a classroom practice as well, again, even in something asynchronous, is to do a grounding exercise. And so to do that, we're just going to do a little bit of some noticing, some mindfulness type exercises. And what I'd like everyone to do is look around your environment for a second and just note what you see in your environment. Maybe you're sitting at a desk. Maybe you're watching this on the couch. Note what you hear in your environment. Maybe you have headphones in and there's no other noise, much like I have with the noise canceling. Maybe you hear outside noises. Maybe there's construction or dogs barking or kids laughing. Maybe you're in a busy office. Whatever that is, take a moment and really think about what you're hearing. And then think about how you're feeling in that space, noticing what you see and hear. How is it that that physically affects you? Does the lack of noise engage you in this presentation? Is it startling? Are you frustrated hearing my voice talking through this? Whatever's coming up for you in this moment, take a moment, think about that, and really put yourself in your space in that way. And I'll give another second for you to do that. Okay, so hopefully we're all present now. We're all here together. We're all noticing our space and noticing the fact that, again, this is asynchronous. We're not in the space together physically, but we are here mentally together in this space, in this digital space. And so the second thing that I want you to do, which really comes from that grounding exercises, is I just want to ask, how's everyone doing? And I know you can't answer me since, again, this is asynchronous, but imagine that you could. What would you say? Is it a hard day? Is it a long day? It's an easy day. Maybe you've come back from summer vacation. Maybe you're about to go on summer vacation. Maybe you're frustrated you don't have a summer vacation. Whatever those sort of feelings are that's coming up for you, think about how you're doing. It could be stressed with a lot of work. It could be that you have many other things going on. It doesn't just have to be in relation to this moment. And answers like fine really aren't reflective. So if something like that would be your first answer, I encourage you to dig deeper, go a little further, and really think about how you're doing in this moment, especially since it's not like you have to answer back. I think this is a good opportunity for you to be honest with yourself about where you're at. Okay, so that's our starting practice. And again, those are the types of things that you can be doing in your classroom, either synchronously or asynchronously. And I will pass this over back to Beth.
Okay, thank you for that grounding. So we're going to start by talking about what it is that we mean when we talk about trauma-informed classroom instruction or trauma-informed pedagogy. It's approaching our instruction, our teaching and learning with this sense that we know that ourselves and our students bring to the classroom our reaction to events that have happened to us within there or outside. It's not an event itself. It's not something we diagnose. We're not clinicians. If we have a student with some sort of serious problem, that's why we have counseling. That's why we can refer them. That's how we can help them best, is by giving them resources with people who can support them. Instead, it's adjusting our responses in the classroom as well to accept the reality that any of our students at any time can be dealing with any range of responses to triggers and events out there in their own lives, to shared events. And it's important to know that we don't all respond the same way. So part of this presentation came to be after Ida and after hurricanes in Lake Charles. And yet we all had a different level of response to that. So it means also not looking to your own response to decide what you want to expect from your students, because they may have a very different type of response. So your students are unique, they're independent of one another and of you and your experiences and your responses. So it's being aware of that and ready to continue the teaching and learning, which is why the reason you're all together gathered in a classroom or in an asynchronous environment, but to make adjustments and adaptations to how you do that. So I think you have thank you. So some examples of practices. There's a lot of text here, so I'm going to kind of hit the bolded parts. Providing information in advance, and that includes descriptions, so people can prepare for content that may be potentially triggering. Creating a safe and inclusive framework, making discussions safe, but at the same time relevant and suitable for a college classroom. Checking in on students, taking that time like we did to ground and ask how we are at the beginning of class. Creating some sort of community in class that gives students a sense of belonging. So sort of a safe identity classroom. You may be familiar with Universal Design for Learning, and you'll know that in that practice they encourage multiple ways to engage with course content, to allow students who have different needs to engage with it, maybe along different pathways, and to create flexibility into your assessments, to the dates, what you expect from people when, and also inviting input from your students and feedback so that you can adjust what you're doing in response to what they express about their experience.
So we're going to break down how we're thinking about our principles and examples today into a few different areas. And these are what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about predictability and transparency, connection and community, flexibility and multiple alternatives, belonging and inclusion, and empowerment and co-creation. And again, there are many ways that you could break this topic down. This is how we are putting together this framework. It is not the only framework that one could use. It's just an easy way for us to help you think about it in a way that we've thought about it, to help go through what these basics are as we're going through them and as we're thinking about them. So we're starting with predictability and transparency. And again, lots of these are sort of the types of things that Beth mentioned in that quicker overview that we're just going to be going into deeper practices or more examples on. And predictability and transparency is really about creating a sense of safety for students who have experienced trauma, because with trauma comes a lack of control, right? And so they feel like they can't control what's happened to them, the response that they're having. And so anything that we can do to sort of create that predictability and transparency will really help them. And some of these are things that people are already doing because they're best classroom practices overall. And some of them are things that maybe we could all work on a little bit. So things like providing information about content in advance of class meeting, things like a syllabus or a course schedule with topics, is probably something that you're doing already. That's pretty standard to provide a syllabus to break that down. Using something like content descriptions and warnings for readings that are potentially triggering, maybe that's not something that you're doing. And I know trigger warnings can be a really hot button issue. And I'm certainly not trying to say everything needs a trigger warning, or you're required to put things together in a certain way. All we're trying to point out is that if there is stuff that could have content that could be triggering, it might be useful to tell people that that kind of content is coming up and allow them to process that on their own. And if you're giving content information ahead of time, you don't necessarily have to give warnings if you're giving descriptions, because you don't know what's going to trigger somebody. And so if somebody is triggered by something that, I don't know, you'd never be able to pick out of a whole bunch of different content, if you're giving descriptions in general, maybe there's something that they would feel comfortable telling you that they are triggered by that you wouldn't be able to predict. Obviously, there's some big topics that maybe we could guess could be triggering, but there's all kinds of little things. Again, we are not therapists, we're not trained in this. It's just about giving your students the opportunity to know that kind of things, those kinds of things in advance, so that they can judge for themselves and really trusting them in that way. In the same way that you would want to do that, you would want to talk to them about interactive elements that may exist. Maybe someone is going to have some issues with something that has to do with an invisible disability or mobility issue that you wouldn't know about, that could be very triggering for them, that's going to happen if there's something that is interactive, just as an example. So those are the types of things that you would want to know or give your students information about in advance. Using a routine can be really helpful. Again, giving that sense of control, making it clear that this is the order that things happen. And if something new is going to happen, giving them detailed instructions so that they know what to expect in advance. And using rubrics can also help with that. Giving clear information in advance and might be something that you are already doing. And then finally, providing them with concrete options about how they can take care of themselves is really useful, because they know then what the structure is within your classroom for when something is happening to them. So it isn't that they would feel awkward having to turn off their camera in a Zoom or walk out of the classroom for 3 minutes, or whatever it is that you have set up. They wouldn't feel awkward having to do that, and it wouldn't be disruptive in a bad way, because you would have set out, if you are having a problem with class content, please follow the following procedures, please do the following. So that can be really useful for making sure that you have clear expectations, they have clear expectations, and you are providing a sense of predictability and transparency. So another aspect of this that can be really important is building connection and community. So building community is important for increasing social engagement after trauma can make people feel really disconnected and isolated. And here in Louisiana, I think most of us have probably experienced this for things like hurricanes, displacement, things like that, as well as how all of us felt during COVID, right? We felt really disconnected. It was hard to feel like a community. So I know we have all experienced this in multiple ways, which means that your students have experienced this in multiple ways. There's research that says that one of the most important factors in student success is people feeling like they belong to the community in a college. And this is a place that we can really foster this, that helps with things like trauma response, but also builds into, again, just good classroom practice in general. So just some things that you can do. You can talk about the importance of community building, learning from each other. You can refer to your course as a community and remind them that they are all in this space together, whether that's an asynchronous space on a learning management system, whether that's a synchronous space over a Zoom or a physical classroom. They are all in this together. We're all learning from each other. We are building. The class is a community itself. in that same sort of way that I did, beginning class with asking how students are doing, how their week has been, doing a temperature check, even if it's through something like an anonymous poll, if they don't want to have to share, can be really useful for making them feel, again, like they are all in this space. And if you give them opportunities to share out, lots of them will, and it will make them feel less isolated because other people may be having similar experiences to what they are having. And then you can really address questions and concerns from a community perspective. And this is something that I really try to practice and I love doing. Again, going back to that community language, what do these things mean for us as a community? How do we want to address this as a community? If someone is having an issue with the discussion, with the class content, with something outside of class that is then affecting them inside of class, how do we as a community want to deal with it? Is it that we want to tell them, go get a drink of water and come back? Is it that we have a procedure where we have 5 minutes at the end of class for people to talk about these things? Is it that they should bring it up in a community board on the LMS and then we would find a time to talk about it? Whatever it is that we've decided, you can bring different possibilities to your community and also ask them to submit some. Ask them as a community, how would they want to deal with it? Treat them as humans who have value in this community together, that they are all building and working on together, rather than as students who are just getting information and that's it, right? You want to create those connections together, and you want to make sure that they're sharing connections outside of class as well as inside of class to really build that at a larger sense. So, and again, as we're continuing on, we get to flexibility and multiple alternatives. For those of you who have done any work with universal design, as Beth mentioned, you're very aware of the importance of having multiple means and multiple types of activities and the way that that can work in terms of universal design. I highly encourage people to look into universal design as a classroom practice in general, not just in terms of trauma, again, as these things can be larger. But an individual, right? When Beth started, she talked about how we are all individuals and we interact with this and come to it, even if it's a larger trauma, in different ways. An individual's response can be really unpredictable. And so we need to be flexible as instructors to meet needs and not re-traumatize our students. And again, it's really hard to know what students' triggers are. You're not going to be able to get a list. And while I can probably guess that something that's about, I don't know, a global pandemic might be triggering to many students, I wouldn't be able to guess that maybe a story about peanut butter could be triggering to a student, right? And so you don't know what those things are that are going to come up, which again is why something like universal design can be really, really helpful here, because it's allowing for different options. So you want to provide different ways of engaging with the material, and you want to provide different ways of making sure that students have ways to interact with that as they go on. So if you know that something is going to be triggering, again, put that out there. If a topic just is triggering and you don't know that, having those multiple means is really going to be key in terms of making sure that your students succeed, which is always the goal here. The goal is not to give your students alternatives so that they can just, I don't know, opt out of something and not engage with the material and like not learn the thing. You want to make sure that they're learning. And maybe that means that they wouldn't read this passage in this particular book, but you want to have something that they could read that's going to get them to the same part of that learning objective. That's really what it is that you are looking for in this particular aspect. So even if you're not going to have them look at the exact same part of the topic or the exact same way, you want to keep the learning objectives in mind. How do we get it so that the student can get to that learning objective, even outside of the maybe normal thing that we have planned? So that's really the focus here with flexibility and multiple alternatives. So again, this is just continuing on that theme. giving you more examples of types of things that could come up, but it could be anything. How you want to be flexible is up to you. And I really do encourage you to look into universal design for learning. The only thing that I would want to specifically go over on this slide that I think I haven't covered as much is something that I feel is part of community, and that discussion of what to do if you are triggered also has to do with talking to students about accommodation beyond what you are required to do from perhaps an Office of Disability Services or an accommodations office. Talking to your students about what they need and what works for them and what you feel comfortable offering. Maybe you are willing to give everyone just a blanket, you get 2 late assignments blanket without even having to tell me like why. You just have to email me ahead of time and say, hey, I need one of my late assignments. And that's an accommodation that you're willing to offer. Maybe you're willing to rework and give someone an essay rather than a multiple choice quiz if they come talk to you in advance. And that's something that you're willing to offer. Letting them know that you have alternatives that you can use for accommodations. And again, that goes beyond ADA and those types of accommodations. But letting them know that you have those sort of alternatives really is going to help them come to you as part of that community and have them feel comfortable talking to you about what they need, again, with the goal of student success in mind, with the goal of getting them to those learning objectives in mind.
I want to thank you for mentioning what you are comfortable offering in terms of from the teacher's point of view, because it can be overwhelming to think about universal design. It can be overwhelming to think about, I have to offer all these alternatives because I want to center and be equitable with all my students and what might be going on with them, and forgetting then about yourself and your own requirements as a teacher. So having a list, having that kind of in a structured form, here's what I know I can manage, is really important.
Absolutely,
and I'm glad you emphasized
absolutely.
that there. You did add some oomph to that. So as Meredith mentioned earlier, belonging and inclusion, lots of research shows that that is a factor in success. That's having some kind of community with other students on campus, but also that contact with a faculty member that my teacher knows me. They know who I am. They see me in the hallway and say hello. Anything like that that tells the student they belong on campus creates a sense of safety and inclusion. So intentionally setting up your classroom and the way you conduct yourself and invite students to conduct themselves then creates that feeling of inclusion. And that can be difficult in the times that we're in. But it is an engagement and learning centered practice that is not just for the sake of doing it. Using students' names and pronouns is not just a sign of respect, it invites them to participate and they feel comfortable instead of that they're in some sort of oppositional framework. And you can signal that this is what you do by using your own in your Zoom name or in the way you introduce yourself. You can be explicit about acknowledging your intention. This is an inclusive classroom, and I'm going to intentionally choose practices that ensure that the range of people in this room know that they have a place that are safe in here to do the kind of discussion that we do, because academia does address difficult topics. It is an oppositional framework at times, but that's with the content and the material, not with one's right to be there and to engage in it. Could you? Yeah, thanks. So you should assume your students might have been affected by topics that come up during class. When I'm teaching literature and I have a range of novels that we're reading, I'm going to assume that something's going to come up in that time frame and over that semester that's going to be uncomfortable, that may be very personal for some of my students. So I'm going to try to be careful about how I state my judgments about those topics. And this is a good example. You don't want to make a big generalized statement about people who, and whatever the condition is or event or trauma that's happening in the content there. So this is an example of suicide People who attempt suicide have fewer support systems. We don't know that. There may be other reasons, there may be other failures. And you could just be making a big statement about someone who's actually sitting there and has experienced this and then feels singled out. It's kind of this, the idea of talking about mistakes as an essential part of the learning process is important too. Failure should be built in. It is built into my classroom. I was very nervous as a younger teacher when I would make an error on the board or miss something and a student would bring it up and say, what about this? Then I started learning how to incorporate that as the learning process. And I felt pretty good about it. It gives them a stake in the process, knowing that they can fail and come back. And that's a growth mindset, right? What you're doing now with this subject and what you're doing later are two different things. And I know that you have the ability to continue growing as we're studying it. Finally, this last point, I've been thinking a lot about this over the past couple of years as we've thought about trauma-informed teaching. I think it's really part of the larger umbrella of equity overall in the classroom, which is why universal design for learning plays such a role in it, but also other practices such as growth mindset, identity, safety in the classroom, kind of a constant feedback between you and students. All of those things recognize equity, which as an issue is the right of every person who's on that campus to experience their learning process, to be where they are in the classroom, in this university, enrolled with this student body. So when you're talking about trauma and addressing issues, knowing that there are all these different students that you have in your classrooms and you can't really tell what's going on with them, you can recognize that if you have students that you recognize are already from a marginalized group, you can assume that maybe their access to resources for that issue that they're going through is not the same and not equitable. And so making your classroom as equitable as possible is one way of providing that kind of resource to them. And also knowing about what resources are on your campus. I can't help a student who's going through certain events, but I might be able to direct them to the right people on campus who do. And I can tell you students don't often know what those resources are. So having something like that in your syllabus, right? What's on campus, here's some important links, here's some offices you should know about. That right there empowers them ahead of time so that when they have a reaction, they know where they can go to get help with that. Kind of leads into this topic. When experiencing trauma, individuals don't necessarily feel like they have the power to respond to it in a way that takes care of themselves. So if we can create that trust in the classroom, they'll come to us for that with those questions. But they'll also have access to the resources they need in terms of that response. So some examples: explicitly state the value of students' knowledge, insights, and expertise within the course. I think I mentioned growth mindset earlier, and I think that's one of the practices that does that. Your ability and what you can do in this course is not limited to what you knew and brought in at the beginning, but what you did bring with you at the beginning is also part of the value of who you are and will help us continue in our learning experience. When we say about asking about preferences, we're going back to providing alternate ways to approach a topic or an assignment or an assessment. I've mentioned having an open line for feedback from students. So that includes asking them and giving them a safe way to express what they need. So maybe an anonymous discussion forum, or just the assurance that if they contact you, you're going to respond, that you do check your email and that you do respond. And that, there aren't any stupid questions when it comes to saying, here's something I'm worried about with my performance in class, or that I'm not going to be able to do this thing. I like this idea of doing a kind of a knowledge check, so we know what students know, what they don't, what their insights are on a topic. I can certainly adapt how I might be approaching something in the classroom if I have a sense of what the range of knowledge is across the class. And it will give me a little more information about who my students are, which creates community in the classroom. I think I already mentioned feedback, but I'm going to encourage to use that midterm survey, which should be, if your university doesn't do that formally, then that's even better, because then that's just between you and your students. You can adjust your classroom, right before midterm. You can make some adjustments for the second half of the term, and it doesn't go into your retention folder or anything like this. It's just a way of improving the student's experience in the class.
Okay, so we started with some grounding practices, some mindfulness practices for ourselves. So I figured I'd just go over some basic ones that you could be using as some basic ideas. Again, this is not an extensive list. This is a quick list. And I just want to quickly hit some of the main ideas of them. So one of the ones that you can use is breathing. There are a bunch of different ways that you can do this. You can do a box breath, which is a 4-4-4-4 type of a breath, right? So inhale for 4, exhale for 4, inhale for 4, exhale for 4. You can trace the outline of something that you have right around you. For lots of people will do like a finger, or your fingers in general. You can inhale while moving the finger up and exhale while moving it down, and just go over that. So there's a physical sensation part of that breathing. You can do some basic breath counting. And then you can do belly breaths for those of you who are maybe in any sort of vocal performance or have vocal performance. You will know that that is actually diaphragmatic breathing. But for those of us who maybe have left the arts, sadly, or that's not part of our everyday practice, breathing in and out of your belly is what people would probably call that. Back in a long time ago, when I was more theatrically inclined, we used to lie on the floor and put a piece of paper or something literally on our stomachs and breathe in and out that way, so that you can see that you're doing it properly. So if someone is concerned that they don't know what a belly breath is, you can literally, even if it's just in your chair, put your hand on your stomach. You can't really see it from where my camera is right now, but if you're breathing into your belly, you'll be able to feel your hand physically move. And that's a deep breath is essentially what you're getting there. So those are some breathing practices that you could easily do. There are vocal practices that you could do, right? So you can hum or buzz or sing, those types of vocal things. Obviously, again, for those of you who are maybe in performing arts, you do vocal warm-ups to some degree. And in some ways, those are grounding and settling practices. Not only are you warming up your instrument, but you are preparing to be sort of in that space and getting yourself into a different headspace in that way. And so you can try some of those. I wind up singing or humming a lot more than I even necessarily intend to, just because of who I am as a person. So that's always a good one for me, because it's something that I'm doing a lot anyway. Not in a way anyone would want to hear, but just for myself. So I like doing that one. And then some that are set in either imagination or in movement. So you can, that's sort of what we did today a little bit. We did, it's not quite imagination, but we did some noticing, some mindfulness. You can think about a time when you felt happy or loved and notice what happens in your body. You really want to note those reactions. You can think about a place in nature that you like to be and try to recall it with your 5 senses. You can remember we talked about sight and sound, and then your physical sensation when we were doing our grounding exercise at the beginning of this presentation. So those are mind ones. And then physical ones, moving around your space, tensing and relaxing a part of your body, which can just be as simple as like tensing up your fingers and relaxing your fingers, and tensing up your fingers and relaxing your fingers, and really moving through that sort of body work. And just, I don't know, stretching your arms, right? Stretching your arms could be a good one, especially in the classroom. And one of the reasons that I like to mention things that are sort of mind breathing, and physical, all of those as options, is because on that point of inclusivity, you don't know who will be in your classroom, what they feel comfortable with, and what their ability may be. So while I maybe am somebody who hums and sings to myself a lot in private, it's not actually something that I like doing in public a lot. So maybe that would put me on edge in a way that doing a mindfulness exercise or thinking about something would not. Maybe if I ask someone to feel a time when they felt loved and happy and they do not have that experience or don't feel that they have that experience, that's something that they could conjure. Um, so maybe that wouldn't work for them. And this is a place really where you can also get community going. You can give your students a few different exercises for grounding and have them choose which one they'd want, either collectively or individually. You can put someone in your class who volunteers, obviously, maybe in charge of your grounding exercise for that day. Again, giving them a list so that there's a prompt could be useful, but something that they can do that they can then encourage. And of course, if you're doing that, make them aware that maybe there are ones that will be easier for some people. If I say move around your space, then you are somebody who moving is not easily available to you at that moment. Maybe that would not be a good practice for you. So you'd always want to make your students aware of those types of things. But overall, it really is a thing that can bring you together in your space, especially at the beginning of class, after something happens, if something triggering has come up, either within the class sort of as a whole, or if you're in a moment like COVID, where everyone is really going to need these types of things. It's something that you can use as a reset to get everyone together into that space, whether that is asynchronous, atemporal, or in a classroom together. You can get everyone into that mindset and into that space by using these practices, which I obviously personally really like doing.
So we have some do's and we have some don'ts, but I want to preface that by harkening back to what we said earlier about your own comfort level and recognizing your own capacity for changing things about your teaching or your classroom practice. Do what you're comfortable with, and looking at the don'ts that come up. Think about what you think are really the most important and will be the most helpful to your students, and work these in to your practice as you're able. I guess the do and don't, if the language of that feels a little, it could be burdensome, and that's not what we're trying to encourage. We're trying to encourage you to think about how your students can learn better, can learn more comfortably, and that means you yourself also being comfortable in that space. So, adopting an attitude of calm and non-judgmental listening, empathizing with students if they come to you and share their reaction to either something going on in the classroom, or maybe share something that's going on with them that they're having a reaction to. I want you to be aware of. Empathy, you can listen, doesn't mean you can solve the problem, but you can be a person who they're safe to talk to. Patience, and that includes with yourself. Reflective comments and different options are both ways that you can respond when a student shares either a query with you, a problem they're having, they need some sort of accommodation or different option. Reflecting on what they're saying and sharing what you're hearing and clarifying it to make sure you understand what they want is all part of that kind of non-judgmental and empathetic response. I think it's very important to ask consent before providing resources. Is this something that you think will help you? I want to let you know that these things exist, and it's up to you how you take advantage of them and whether and if you do. But if you want me to point you to somewhere on campus, You know, we have a food bank. If your students come to you saying they're having problems taking care of themselves, we have counseling on campus. Student affairs might know something about healthcare, housing, you know, anything that you have on a list of resources, but letting them know that you respect their autonomy and ability to make decisions about that. So some sample language. It's good to have some things in your toolbox. Thanks so much for sharing that with me. Do what's good for you. I'll just be here, etc. You can see the list. Appreciate you being willing to share that. Giving them options for how they might want to engage. Turn off your video is fine. Mute yourself or you stay connected. That's fine. I think these are just largely kind of mirror images of the do's. Don't make decisions that remove their control. That's asking consent and recognizing their autonomy. Don't rush to make assessments or provide resources. Don't try to fix things for your students that aren't, you know, it's not necessarily a matter of fixing something, it's more a matter of listening. Don't use shaming or threats or patronizing statements. Certainly don't touch someone without their consent or react in a way that is judgmental, alarmed, horrified, embarrassed, and sarcasm, right? Not a good thing. Not a good thing in the classroom. Remarkably, a lot of students just don't hear sarcasm as humor. So if there's one don't, I would really encourage you to adopt. It's just to drop some of that analytical tone that is so easy to come by in academia.
I deeply agree with that. And I know that's something that I myself have trouble with as
I
a
have been the
very
victim of that in
sarcastic
the class. I
human.
am sitting here thinking about French 1001 and just the meanest teacher. I
Yeah.
didn't open my mouth to participate in anything verbal whenever I could help it because I knew there would be a sarcastic statement about it. So that I learned something about teaching long before I even went into it.
Off in the way. So that's the end of our presentation today. And what I really want to do, the same way that we started with a grounding exercise, I want to make sure that you are checking in with yourself now, and that you would also check in with yourself in the moment after some sort of event happened. Because as Beth mentioned, you are a person as well. And if this is person first, you can only do what you can do. And anything that comes up for you, either in this presentation or again in the moment in one of those events, when someone is triggered, when someone has talked to you, that could bring things up for you that you need to address. And it's important to keep yourself centered in that. You know, you can do things like ask your students if they need resources and give supportive and reflective language and things like that. But even as you are doing that, it could bring up something for yourself. Maybe even the thought of going through this presentation today brought up something for you, and you need to check in with yourself. And that's fine. But don't be afraid to allow yourself to have emotions, to have feelings about these types of things, and to be a person. Your students are people, you are a person, and you will never be able to be a teacher in a vacuum outside of that. It's just not possible. You bring in your own experiences, you bring in your own life, and that's part of what makes a classroom community good and vibrant and interesting. But it does also mean that you could have some of these issues come up for you in that moment. So the same way that I would want you to in one of those moments, I want you to at the end of this presentation, just check in with yourself. What can you do to settle yourself if anything upset you? What can you do? Reflect on what you've learned today that maybe was new for you. What could you do to help prepare yourself in a moment where a student or you or both are getting upset or triggered or having a trauma response in that moment? So just take a minute after this presentation and give yourself a little time for reflection and give yourself a little time to be human. That is all for us on using trauma informed practices in the classroom. And we hope that this has been useful and informative, and many of these practices will be things that you're able to take forward with you into your classrooms in the future. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.